Imagine a black African general so brilliant that he made Rome, the most powerful empire on earth, tremble in fear for over 15 years. He crossed the Alps with war elephants, slaughtered Roman armies by the tens of thousands, and nearly erased Rome from history. Yet today, Hollywood casts him white. Textbooks hide his heritage, and most people have never heard his full story. This is Hannibal Barca. The year is 247 BCE, and the Mediterranean world is about to witness the birth of a legend. In the bustling port city of Carthage, on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Tunisia, a child is born into one of the most powerful families in the ancient world. His name is Hannibal Barca, and his father, Hamilcar, is a military commander who has just suffered the most humiliating defeat of his career. Carthage, a wealthy North African superpower that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, has lost the First Punic War to an upstart power from Italy, Rome. The terms of surrender are brutal: massive tribute payments, loss of territories, and the shame of defeat hanging over Carthaginian pride like a storm cloud. But Hamilcar Barca is not a man who accepts defeat easily. According to ancient historians, he takes his 9-year-old son to a sacred temple and makes him swear an oath before the gods. The boy places his small hand on the sacrificial altar, and with fire burning in his young eyes, he vows eternal hatred of Rome. Hannibal will never forget this moment. It will define his entire life, drive every decision he makes, and nearly bring the greatest empire the world has ever known to its knees. To understand Hannibal's story, you need to understand Carthage. This wasn't some primitive settlement. Carthage was founded by Phoenician settlers from the eastern Mediterranean, but over centuries it had become deeply intertwined with indigenous North African peoples, the Berbers and Numidians who had inhabited these lands for millennia. Hannibal's mother was likely Berber, making him ethnically and culturally African. The city itself was a marvel of the ancient world, with massive walls, a sophisticated harbor system, and wealth that made Roman senators green with envy. Carthaginian ships sailed from Britain to sub-Saharan Africa, trading in precious metals, ivory, and purple dye worth more than gold. While Rome was still a regional power struggling to control Italy, Carthage was an international superpower with colonies spanning the Mediterranean. But here's where the story gets complicated, where history starts to blur and fade like an old painting left in the sun. Because Rome won the Punic Wars, and winners write history. And when European scholars centuries later looked back at this African general who nearly destroyed Rome, they faced a problem. How do you reconcile the narrative of African inferiority, the same narrative used to justify colonialism and slavery, with the historical fact that an African general was one of the greatest military minds who ever lived? The answer was simple. You erase him. You whitewash him. You make people forget. Renaissance artists painted Hannibal with European features, pale skin, and classical Greco-Roman appearance. When Hollywood made films about the Punic Wars, they cast white actors. Textbooks carefully avoided mentioning Carthage as an African civilization, instead calling it Phoenician or Mediterranean, as if those terms somehow negated its African identity. 19th-century colonial scholars, desperate to maintain the myth that Africa had produced no great civilizations, dismissed Carthage as not really African, despite the fact that it sat on African soil, was populated largely by Africans, and had been a North African power for over 600 years. They couldn't deny Hannibal's genius. The historical record was too clear, too overwhelming. So instead, they changed his appearance, his identity, his very essence. They made him white in the popular imagination. The irony is almost too perfect. The very people Hannibal nearly destroyed, the Romans whose armies he slaughtered, whose empire he brought to the edge of extinction, those same people are the ones who wrote his history. And they had every reason to diminish who he really was. But let's get back to the young Hannibal, growing up in the shadow of Carthage's defeat. His father takes him to Iberia, modern-day Spain, where Carthage is rebuilding its power and wealth through new conquests. Hannibal grows up in military camps, learning warfare from the ground up. He learns to fight alongside Numidian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the ancient world. He learns logistics, strategy, diplomacy, and the art of holding together a multicultural army. By the time he's in his 20s, he's already proven himself a formidable commander. When his father and brother-in-law both die, the army proclaims Hannibal, at just 26 years old, as their supreme commander. Rome watches nervously. They remember his father. They remember that oath. In 218 BCE, Hannibal makes a decision that will echo through history. Rome expects that if war comes, it will be fought in Iberia or Africa, on familiar ground, where their superior navy gives them an advantage. But Hannibal has other plans. He's going to invade Italy itself, strike at the heart of Roman power, turn their allies against them, and watch their empire crumble from within. There's just one problem. To reach Italy by land, he'll have to cross the Pyrenees Mountains, march through hostile Gallic territory, and then, most impossibly, cross the Alps, the towering mountain range that forms a natural barrier protecting Italy from the north. In winter, with an army of 50,000 men, thousands of horses, and 38 war elephants. When Roman scouts bring news of Hannibal's plans, the Senate laughs. It's impossible. It's suicide. The Alps in winter have defeated entire armies before. The narrow mountain passes, the freezing temperatures, the hostile tribes, the sheer cliffs and avalanches. It's a death sentence. They're so confident in the impossibility of Hannibal's plan that they don't even send armies to defend the northern approaches. They'll fight him in Spain, they decide, where he'll surely stay. But Hannibal isn't like other generals. He's spent years planning this. He's negotiated with Gallic tribes, secured supply routes, and calculated every risk. More than that, he understands psychology. He knows that if he can achieve the impossible, if he can appear in Italy like a ghost materializing from thin air, the shock alone will be worth the cost. So, in the spring of 218 BCE, his army begins to march. They cross the Pyrenees, fighting through hostile tribes. They ford rivers, navigate forests, and push through Gaul. Then, in late autumn, with winter approaching, they begin the ascent into the Alps. What happens next is the stuff of legend. The army climbs narrow paths barely wide enough for the elephants, with sheer drops into mist-covered valleys below. Rock slides triggered by hostile mountain tribes kill hundreds. The temperature drops below freezing. Men who've spent their entire lives in the Mediterranean sun find themselves struggling through snowdrifts, watching their companions collapse from hypothermia. The elephants, those massive war beasts that Hannibal brought to terrorize Roman legions, struggle through ice and snow, their feet bloodied and raw. Food runs low. Hannibal loses nearly half his army in those mountains, 25,000 men who will never see Italy. But he makes it. Against all odds, in late 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca descends from the Alps into the Po Valley in northern Italy with 26,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and fewer than a dozen elephants still alive. Rome's worst nightmare has come true. The African general is inside their homeland, and they have no idea how to stop him. The Romans send an army to crush this foolish invader. At the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal lures them into a trap and destroys them. He wins again at Lake Trasimene, ambushing a Roman army in the fog and killing 15,000 Romans in a single morning. Rome, which has never lost on Italian soil, is suddenly facing an enemy who seems to win every battle effortlessly. Panic spreads through the city. Who is this man? How does he keep defeating armies twice his size? But Rome hasn't seen anything yet. Because in 216 BCE, at a place called Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal is about to fight the most perfect battle in military history. Rome is done underestimating him. They've raised the largest army in their history. 86,000 men, almost the entire military strength of the Republic. They've put 2 consuls in command, given them strict orders. Find Hannibal and crush him once and for all. When they meet Hannibal's army near Cannae, the Romans are confident. They outnumber him nearly 2 to 1. They have more infantry, more cavalry, more everything. This is where Rome will restore its honor, where they'll destroy the African who dared challenge their supremacy. Hannibal looks at the Roman army and smiles. He's been waiting for this. His army of 50,000 men forms up for battle, but in an unusual formation. His center is weak. Gallic and Iberian infantry, who he knows will bend under Roman pressure. His flanks are strong, anchored by his best African infantry. His cavalry, those magnificent Numidian horsemen, sit on the wings. The Romans see the weak center and think they've already won. They'll punch through the middle, split Hannibal's army in half, and slaughter them from the inside out. It's a sound plan. It should work. The battle begins on August 2nd, 216 BCE. The Roman infantry, confident and aggressive, crashes into Hannibal's center line. As predicted, his center begins to bend backward, forming a crescent shape. The Romans push harder, scenting victory, pouring more and more men into that bulging center. They're so focused on the breakthrough that they don't notice Hannibal's cavalry has destroyed the Roman cavalry on both flanks. They don't notice his African infantry wheeling inward, closing like the jaws of a trap. They don't notice that they've walked into a killing box. And then the trap springs shut. Hannibal's cavalry hits the Roman rear. His African infantry closes in from both sides. The Romans, packed so tightly they can barely lift their weapons, suddenly realize they're completely surrounded. There's no retreat. There's no escape. There's only slaughter. For the next several hours, Hannibal's army systematically butchers the Roman legions. The afternoon sun beats down on a scene of absolute carnage. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans die that day, so many that the nearby Aufidus River literally runs red with blood. Bodies pile so high that survivors hide beneath corpses, praying Carthaginian soldiers won't notice them. One Roman consul dies fighting. The other flees in shame. When news reaches Rome, the city falls into despair. Women throw themselves from rooftops. Senators commit suicide. Mothers forbid their sons from even speaking Hannibal's name, as if saying it aloud might summon him to their gates. And Hannibal, the African general that Rome had dismissed and underestimated, stands on the battlefield at Cannae, victorious, untouchable, seemingly invincible. Military academies still study the Battle of Cannae today, over 2,200 years later, as the perfect example of a double envelopment maneuver. Hannibal didn't just win a battle. He fought the perfect battle. For the next 15 years, Hannibal occupies Italy. He can't take Rome itself. His army isn't large enough for a siege, and Carthage, exhausted and divided, won't send reinforcements. But he doesn't leave. He stays in Italy, a constant threat, a living nightmare that Rome cannot defeat and cannot ignore. They try everything. They send army after army, and he defeats them all. They try to avoid battle, and he ravages their countryside. They hire new generals, develop new tactics, and still Hannibal wins. Rome, the rising superpower of the Mediterranean, is brought to its knees by one African general who refuses to give up. But even legends have endings. Rome, realizing they cannot defeat Hannibal in Italy, makes a desperate gamble. They'll bypass him entirely and attack Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend his homeland. In 202 BCE, Hannibal finally leaves Italy undefeated after 15 years and returns to Africa for the first time since his childhood. At the Battle of Zama, he faces a young Roman general named Scipio, who has spent years studying Hannibal's tactics, learning from his defeats. Scipio uses Hannibal's own strategies against him. The battle is close, but exhaustion, betrayal by Numidian allies who switch sides, and simply the weight of years finally catch up to Hannibal. He loses his first major battle. Carthage sues for peace on humiliating terms. Hannibal goes into exile, hunted by Rome across the Mediterranean. They cannot forgive him. They cannot forget what he did. For years they chase him from kingdom to kingdom, until finally, in 183 BCE, Roman soldiers surround his final refuge. Hannibal, now an old man, has one last act of defiance. Rather than give Rome the satisfaction of capturing him, he drinks poison he's carried for years, knowing this day would come. His last words, according to ancient sources, are these: "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have been so long under, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, they erased it. In 146 BCE, 57 years after Hannibal's death, Rome returned to Carthage and burned it to the ground. They killed or enslaved every person they could find. They destroyed every building, every monument, every library. They salted the earth so nothing would grow. They wanted to erase Carthage from existence, to make it as if this African superpower had never existed at all. And they nearly succeeded. Almost everything we know about Hannibal comes from Roman sources, from the very people who hated him, feared him, and wanted to diminish his legacy. The Carthaginian records, their histories, their own accounts of the wars, all destroyed. When you realize that the only detailed accounts of Hannibal's genius come from his enemies' chronicles, it makes his achievements even more staggering. Even the people who hated him couldn't deny his brilliance. But the erasure didn't stop with Carthage's destruction. Fast forward to colonial Europe, to the 18th and 19th centuries when European powers were carving up Africa and justifying it with pseudoscientific racism. These colonizers needed to believe that Africans were inferior, that they had never built great civilizations, that they needed European guidance and rule. And then they looked at their history books and saw Hannibal Barca, an African general who nearly destroyed Rome, who outwitted Roman generals for decades, who fought the perfect battle at Cannae. This was a problem. This contradicted their entire narrative. So they did what conquerors always do. They changed the story. They painted him white, literally and figuratively. Art from the Renaissance onward depicted Hannibal with European features, sometimes even blonde hair. Scholars began insisting that Carthage wasn't really African, that it was a Phoenician colony, as if 700 years of existence on African soil, intermarriage with African peoples, and African cultural integration meant nothing. They created a distinction that had never existed in the ancient world, separating North Africa from real Africa to preserve their prejudices. When Hollywood made movies about Rome, they cast white actors as Hannibal, continuing the whitewashing into the modern era. Modern DNA studies of North African populations confirm what should have been obvious all along. Ancient Carthaginians were a mix of Phoenician, Berber, and other African peoples. Hannibal's mother was almost certainly Berber. He grew up in Africa, fought for an African power, and led armies composed largely of African soldiers. His identity was African. But that truth has been systematically obscured for centuries because it interferes with comfortable lies about African achievement. And here's what they really don't want you to know. Carthage wasn't just powerful. It was richer than Rome before the wars. Its trade networks stretched from Britain, where they bought tin, to sub-Saharan Africa, where they traded for gold and ivory. Carthaginian explorers circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years before Europeans would claim to discover the continent. The city itself was a wonder of engineering and architecture that rivaled anything in Greece or Rome. When Roman soldiers finally entered Carthage after the Third Punic War, they were stunned by the wealth, the sophistication, the sheer grandeur of what they were about to destroy. This wasn't some backwater they were conquering. This was a civilization that in many ways surpassed their own. The Punic language, the architectural innovations, the agricultural techniques, all of it influenced the entire Mediterranean world. But because Carthage was destroyed so thoroughly, because the Romans wanted its memory obliterated, and because later Europeans wanted to maintain their myths about Africa, most people today know almost nothing about one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. Think about the names you learned in school when they taught you about ancient history. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Marcus Aurelius, Alexander the Great. These men are household names, celebrated and remembered. But Hannibal Barca, who nearly ended Roman civilization before it truly began, who fought one of the longest and most brilliant military campaigns in history, who was so feared that Roman parents used his name to scare children for generations, his story is barely known. That's not an accident. That's not an oversight. That's deliberate erasure. Even Romans who hated him, who wanted him dead, who celebrated his defeat, even they had to acknowledge his genius. The Roman historian Livy, writing decades after Hannibal's death, called him one of the greatest commanders who ever lived. Roman generals studied his tactics. They named their fears after him. Hannibal at the gates became synonymous with existential threat. He lived in their nightmares for generations, yet somehow, in our modern telling of history, he's reduced to a footnote, a curiosity, the guy with the elephants. Here's the truth they've spent 2,000 years trying to obscure. Hannibal's story isn't an anomaly. He wasn't some miraculous exception that proves the rule. He was part of a pattern, part of a long history of African achievement that has been systematically erased, dismissed, or attributed to anyone but Africans. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca, carrying so much gold that he destabilized the Mediterranean economy, European scholars later insisted his wealth must have been exaggerated. When the kingdom of Kush conquered Egypt and ruled as pharaohs, they called them the foreign dynasty, as if Kush wasn't an African civilization. When Timbuktu became a center of learning with universities and libraries that rivaled any in Europe, colonizers later burned those libraries and claimed Africa had no written history. When Queen Nzinga fought Portuguese colonizers to a standstill, European historians depicted her as a savage, ignoring her brilliant military and diplomatic strategies. The pattern is always the same: erase, diminish, whitewash, forget. Make people believe that African achievement is impossible, that African genius is a contradiction in terms, and the most insidious part is how well it's worked. How many people, even today, picture ancient Africa as primitive and undeveloped? How many believe that civilization flowed only from Europe and the Middle East? How many have never heard of Carthage, or Great Zimbabwe, or the Nubian kingdoms, or the Swahili city-states? This is why Hannibal's story matters. Not just because he was a military genius, though he was. Not just because he nearly changed the entire course of Western civilization, though he did. But because his erasure, his whitewashing, his removal from the popular consciousness is part of a larger project of making African history disappear, of making people forget that before colonialism, before slavery, before the lies and the erasure, Africa had empires. It had generals like Hannibal, who made the greatest powers on earth tremble. It had wealth that made Rome envious. It had sophistication, culture, achievement, and brilliance. The greatest lie ever told wasn't that slavery was benign, or that colonialism was charitable. The greatest lie was that black history began with slavery, that African achievement was non-existent before European contact, that the greatest contributions Africans ever made were as labor for someone else's civilization. That lie required erasing millennia of African history, of African empire, of African genius. It required taking men like Hannibal Barca and pretending they were anything but what they were, African. Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with war elephants. He defeated Rome's greatest armies in battles that are still studied today. He occupied Italy for 15 years, undefeated and unbroken. He nearly ended Roman civilization before it reached its height. He was African, he was black, and they've spent 2,000 years trying to make you forget. Now you know. Don't let them erase us again. This is our history. These are our ancestors. These are our stories, and they deserve to be told in full, without erasure, without whitewashing, without apology. Hannibal Barca was Africa's greatest general. Remember his name. Remember where he came from, and remember what he achieved. Because this isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder that African excellence isn't new, isn't an exception, and isn't something that requires validation from anyone else. It's always been there. They just tried to hide it. Now it's time to bring it back into the light.